Coulter Briggs stood beside Bus 17 at the far edge of the Hawthorne Ridge Academy graduation grounds, wearing a uniform that had faded through 7 Pennsylvania winters and shoes that had logged more early mornings than anyone in that parking lot cared to count. To Tessa Mercer, the CEO, whose name was already being measured for the brass lettering above the school's newest building, he was simply a driver who had wandered too close to the stage where the significant people stood. She laughed, not quietly and not apologetically, and told him that a bus driver ought to know where he belonged. Coulter said nothing. He already knew she was preparing to cut the route that had carried hundreds of scholarship students to that very stage. But when 300 graduates rose to their feet, each holding a letter, the entire auditorium went absolutely still. If you've ever believed that the people who matter most are never the ones standing at the center of the stage, stay until the end. The graduation ceremony at Hawthorne Ridge Academy that June morning was built the way the school liked to build everything, with precision, deliberate beauty, and an eye toward the photographs that would end up in quarterly newsletters and regional newspaper features. The grounds of the main lawn had been transformed overnight. Navy carpet unrolled in 2 long lanes toward a raised stage, flanked by arrangements of white garden roses, their petals still tight from the morning chill, their fragrance just strong enough to reach the front rows of white folding chairs, where parents in summer blazers settled into conversation about where their children had been accepted and at what scholarship level. A local television crew had set up near the entrance arch, their camera on a raised tripod pointing toward the podium, bearing the school seal in gold and navy. Along the sides of the lawn, trustees and the school's largest donors occupied a reserved section roped in white silk cord, their programs printed on heavier cardstock than those distributed to the general audience. It was, by every external measure, the kind of event Hawthorne Ridge had spent 2 decades calibrating, beautiful, controlled, and quietly convincing in the story it told about itself. What the camera crew did not know, and what several attendees would only learn later, was that the school's facilities team had been asked to reposition the bus staging area to the far eastern lot behind the maintenance wing. The request had come, indirectly, passed through the events coordinator to the operations director, with language about visual cohesion and photographic composition. In practical terms, it meant the 3 yellow buses that had delivered dozens of scholarship students each semester were parked out of frame, out of the official photographs, and out of the sight line from the stage. Tessa Mercer, who had spoken with the school's communications director that morning about the placement of the Mercer Legacy Group banner above the entrance, had been clear the photographs from this event would serve as the anchor image for the announcement of her $5 million leadership center, and she did not want the composition cluttered by institutional infrastructure that did not project the right message. Bus 17 had arrived at 6:45 in the morning, well before the grounds crew had finished placing the last row of chairs. Coulter Briggs had pulled the vehicle into position himself, checked the tire pressure with the same deliberateness he brought to every pre-shift inspection, and wiped a smear of road dust from the driver's side mirror with the sleeve of his uniform jacket. The bus carried a quiet history in its small details. Along the upper rim of the windshield, a strip of masking tape held a row of handwritten notes, an exam schedule, a college application deadline, a hand-drawn arrow that one student had stuck there the previous fall with the words "Keep Going" written in blue marker, still faintly legible. On the shelf above the dashboard sat a flat container of individually wrapped granola bars and a small box of tissues restocked every Monday morning at Coulter's own expense. Harper Briggs had ridden with her father that morning, as she had done on significant school days since she was old enough to climb the steps without holding the railing. She was 19 now, enrolled at the state university on a partial academic scholarship, and she had grown up watching her father work categorized that most people in Hawthorne Ridge categorized somewhere between invisible and peripheral. She knew that he had been invited to today's ceremony. Delaney Brooks had called him personally the week before, and she had assumed, without examining the assumption too closely, that the invitation meant he would be welcomed somewhere near the event itself. When the facilities coordinator directed them to the eastern lot, Harper had watched her father nod once, say thank you, and pull the bus forward without complaint. She had not said what she was thinking. There would be time for that later. Tessa Mercer arrived at 9:10 in a dark car that pulled directly to the reserved lot adjacent to the stage entrance. She stepped out in tailored cream linen, her son Preston walking slightly behind her, his graduation gown folded over his arm and his expression carrying the studied neutrality of someone who had learned to navigate public events by watching his mother work through them. Tessa carried the announcement of her foundation's new gift in an envelope in her clutch, the formal language already rehearsed, the framing already tested with the communications firm that handled Mercer Legacy Group's public presence. What she had not put into any official document, what lived instead in an appendix of the proposed facilities agreement, was the condition that would reshape the school's budget priorities in ways that most of the families seated on that lawn could not have imagined even if they had read the program end to end 3 times. Delaney Brooks had been moving quietly through the crowd since 8:30, stopping to speak with individual students, checking her clipboard, and occasionally disappearing behind the stage curtain before reappearing with the focused calm of someone managing something considerably larger than a graduation ceremony. She had arranged with Cassidy Monroe, the assistant to the principal's office, to have Coulter escorted toward the reserved guest section approximately 40 minutes before the ceremony began. Not center stage, but close enough to the front that he would be in clear view when his name was called. Cassidy had confirmed the arrangement twice and had printed a laminated guest pass with Coulter's name on it, the kind distributed to board members and principal donors. When she found him in the eastern lot and walked him toward the lawn, the pass was in her hand, and the plan was, as far as anyone involved knew, still entirely intact. Tessa Mercer noticed Coulter the moment he crossed onto the main lawn. She was standing near the stage steps speaking with a board trustee when she saw a man in a gray bus driver's uniform walking alongside Cassidy Monroe through the roped entrance to the reserved section. The incongruity registered immediately, not as confusion but as something closer to offense, the way a person trained to read rooms feels when the room is not arranged to specification. She excused herself from the trustee and intercepted them before they reached the white silk rope. She asked Cassidy, pleasantly, but with the kind of clarity that made the pleasantness irrelevant, why a member of the transportation staff was being escorted into the reserved section. Cassidy explained that Coulter Briggs was a special guest for a portion of the program that the school's guidance team had coordinated. Tessa did not accept this as an answer. She said that the reserved section was designated for donors, board members, and principal family guests, and that regardless of what the guidance team had arranged, it would create a confusing visual for attendees and media who were expecting a consistent atmosphere in that area. Her voice was pleasant the entire time. She never raised it. She never needed to. two parents who had been standing nearby turned toward the exchange. One of them offered a small laugh, not cruel, precisely, but the kind that happens when someone in a position of social authority makes a dismissive observation and a nearby audience ratifies it without quite deciding to. Coulter stood in his faded uniform and said nothing, his hands loose at his sides, his expression steady. Cassidy looked at her clipboard. Tessa looked at Coulter. Then she said it directly. A bus driver should know where he belongs, and the stage was built for the people who created futures, not for the people who transported others toward them. She said it the way someone delivers an observation they believe to be not unkind but simply accurate, the way a person who has organized the world into categories of significance states the categories and moves on. Several people heard it. Nobody pushed back. Coulter looked at her for a moment before he spoke. He said that sometimes, without the right route running at the right time, some kids would never arrive at the future at all. It was a quiet sentence, delivered without performance, without waiting for a reaction. Tessa looked at him with the expression of someone who has been offered a bumper sticker, where they expected a spreadsheet, and she permitted herself a short, dismissive laugh. She told Cassidy to find Coulter a seat near the bus staging area, and then turned back toward the stage steps. Harper had been watching from 20 feet away. Her jaw had tightened from the moment Tessa intercepted them, and by the time Tessa laughed, Harper had already begun walking forward. Coulter stopped her with a hand on her arm before she got within speaking distance of the CEO. He shook his head once, very slightly, and guided her back toward the edge of the lawn with the unhurried authority of a man who had decided exactly what this morning was going to be, and was not going to let a 4-minute exchange alter the architecture of it. What Tessa did not know, what she could not have known without reading the full program that Delaney and Cassidy had carefully guarded from administrative revision, was that the moment she had just created, the laugh and the dismissal in front of board members and a local television crew, would become the exact context that made everything that followed not just emotionally resonant, but structurally decisive. She had handed the afternoon its hinge point, casually, while thinking about the placement of her banner. The version of Coulter Briggs that most of Hawthorne Ridge Academy had ever seen was the one in the uniform. The early arrival, the deliberate pre-shift check, the person who held the door of bus 17 open every morning at the same stop in the same sequence, who remembered every student's name after 2 days and never seemed to forget it. What they had not seen, because Coulter had no particular desire to explain it, was the version that had existed before the uniform. The man who had spent 11 years as a transport safety systems engineer for a contracting firm in Pittsburgh, designing the restraint and alert systems used in school bus fleets across 4 states, whose work had been cited in a State Department of Transportation safety review, and who had, by his late 30s, built a career that by every standard measure was tracking upward at a reliable and irreversible incline. His wife Paige had died in the spring, not dramatically and not suddenly, but in the slow, reorganizing way that a long illness eventually runs out of room to renegotiate. She had been 38. Harper had been 12. Coulter had spent the 6 months after the funeral completing contracted projects, attending Harper's school events with the punctuality of someone who had organized grief into a calendar, and eventually arriving at the conclusion that he had been measuring the wrong things for a long time. The job in Pittsburgh paid well. It kept him informed and respected, and occasionally asked to speak at industry conferences. It did not keep him in the same building as his daughter during the hours when a 12-year-old needed a parent to be physically present rather than competently present at a distance. He resigned in the following October. He applied for a position as a school bus driver at Hawthorne Ridge Academy, not because it was the only job available, but because the route schedules aligned with Harper's school day, because the position had been listed with a note about serving the scholarship transportation program, and because Coulter had spent more than a decade thinking about school vehicles from the engineering side and felt, with a directness that surprised even him, that he wanted to know what they looked like from the inside. Several people told him he was throwing away a career. A former colleague from Pittsburgh called twice to ask if the resignation had been a mistake. Coulter thanked him both times and did not return the third call. What Coulter found inside Bus 17 during his first week was a vehicle doing approximately 3 times what its operations manual suggested it was designed for. The route covered scholarship students who lived between 20 and 40 miles from campus. Students who had no alternative transportation and whose academic calendars depended entirely on the consistency of the pickup schedule. He found students eating nothing for the first period of the day because the nearest food source was inaccessible before the bus departed. He found one student who had been missing the opening class intermittently for 2 months because a pickup point required a 3-block walk that was problematic in winter ice without adequate footwear. He found another managing a chronic anxiety condition that peaked during the transition from home to school, who had developed a habit of arriving at the bus stop 20 minutes early, simply because the quiet wait was the most predictable part of the day. He began making changes the way engineers do, methodically, without announcing them. He reconfigured 2 pickup points with the operations director's approval, secured a standing agreement with the cafeteria to provide a small supply of breakfast items for the route, and installed a small whiteboard at the front of the bus that he updated weekly with exam schedules and application reminders. When the heating system failed one February and the maintenance queue ran 3 weeks behind, he sourced the correct replacement component himself and asked a mechanic friend to install it on a Saturday morning, covering the labor cost from his own paycheck and filing the parts receipt for later reimbursement. In his second year, he submitted a formal proposal to the administration, 4 pages, clearly organized, with supporting data, outlining a framework he called the Route 17 Access Program, a structured approach to ensuring that scholarship students in outlying zip codes could maintain consistent attendance regardless of transportation barriers. The administration approved it 6 weeks later. In the 7 years since, the program had served more than 400 students. None of this was information Coulter had ever led with in conversation. He had simply driven the route every morning, learned the names, kept the granola bars stocked, and watched the students whose lives ran on Bus 17 graduate 1 year at a time. Sterling Quinn had been reviewing the annexes to the Mercer Legacy Group gift agreement on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks before graduation when he found the language that stopped him mid-page. He was not a man who startled easily. 30 years in education administration had given him a tolerance for bureaucratic complexity that most people would find exhausting, but the clause in question was not complex. It was remarkably clear once you understood what the terms were describing. The agreement called for a restructuring of the school's operational budget concurrent with the acceptance of the $5 million gift, with specific language directing that transportation expenditures be evaluated for efficiency alignment, and that routes serving fewer than a defined threshold of students per mile be considered for consolidation or discontinuation in the following fiscal year. Route 17, which served a geographically dispersed population of scholarship students across a large radius, would fail that threshold by a significant margin. The language had been drafted carefully enough that no single sentence said anything explicitly inadvisable. The paragraph as a whole said it plainly. Sterling brought it to Vaughn Holloway the following morning. Vaughn read it twice, set it down, and sat quietly for a moment, in the way that a person sits when they have just been handed a confirmation of something they had hoped was not true. The school needed the Mercer gift. The endowment had been under pressure for 2 consecutive fiscal years. The deferred maintenance list was growing, and the proposed leadership center had already been mentioned in 2 regional press releases as an example of the school's forward momentum. Vaughn had told the board in February that the gift was close to final. Reversing course now, publicly, would require a set of explanations he was not certain he could make coherently. Coulter learned about the annex language the way people who are not invited to relevant meetings tend to learn things, sideways through operational details. A request came through his supervisor asking him to prepare a comprehensive data summary of Route 17, total students served by academic year, attendance consistency metrics, distance per student per route day, operating cost breakdowns. It was framed as a routine administrative review. Coulter completed the summary in 2 evenings, organized it into a 4-page document with supporting charts, and submitted it through the standard operations channel. It was not until the following day, when a colleague mentioned that transportation data had been specifically requested by the Mercer Group's finance team, that Coulter understood what the summary was actually being used for. He submitted a separate addendum, 8 paragraphs, closely argued, focused entirely on the academic outcomes of the students the route served. Through the same channel with a notation requesting that it be included with the original summary when forwarded to any external reviewing party. The addendum never reached Tessa Mercer's team. It was held at the level of administrative review as outside the scope of the financial analysis, and Coulter was informed of this in a brief email from the operations director's assistant. Delaney Brooks heard about the addendum because Coulter had sent her a copy, not as an escalation but simply as information. She read it on a Wednesday night at her kitchen table and then read it again. She had already been collecting letters from the graduating class for 3 weeks by that point, having proposed the idea to students in her caseload as a way of honoring the adults in the school community who had shaped their experience in ways the official ceremony would not capture. The response had been larger than she expected. By the time she read Coulter's addendum, she had received 162 letters, and the pile on her kitchen table was still growing. She understood, reading the addendum alongside the letters, that what she had assembled was not a sentimental tribute, but a body of evidence. She spent the next 2 weeks gathering the remaining letters with a quiet urgency that her students recognized but did not fully understand, and she organized the full collection of 300 into a polished wooden box that she had asked a carpentry teacher to make, its lid engraved with the words, "Route 17, the road that brought us here." The letters themselves were not the kind of writing that appears on plaques or in dedication programs. They were the writing of 18-year-olds being asked to tell the truth in a low-stakes environment, which meant they were specific and occasional, and sometimes grammatically imperfect and far more honest than most adults manage in formal contexts. A student named Marcus wrote that without the free route, his parents would have had to pull him from Hawthorne Ridge in the 2nd semester of his sophomore year, when his father's 2nd job ended and the family lost access to a working vehicle. He wrote that nobody in administration had ever known this because there was no mechanism in the system for a student to say it, but that Coulter had known because Coulter had noticed that Marcus was quiet on Mondays in a specific way and had asked him once, without fanfare, what was going on. And the conversation that followed had produced a discreet referral to Delaney's office that resulted in a transportation hardship waiver Marcus had not known existed. A student named Priya wrote about the mornings when she was managing her younger brother's breakfast and school departure before her own, which meant she frequently arrived at the pickup point after the official departure window. She wrote that Coulter had never, in 3 years, driven past without her. She wrote that she had never asked him to wait and that he had never mentioned it. He had simply factored it into his timing, with the discreet precision of someone who had decided that the route existed for the people on it, and not the other way around. A student named Eli wrote that in the spring of his junior year he had eaten breakfast on bus 17 every single day because there was no breakfast at home during that period, and that the granola bar on the dashboard shelf was not a minor detail, but, for approximately 11 weeks, the most reliable food source in his morning. He had never told anyone this. He was telling it now because Delaney had asked, and because he was leaving for college in 8 weeks, and felt that the story deserved to exist somewhere outside of his own memory. Preston Mercer's letter was different in register but not in substance. He had written it in one sitting on a Sunday afternoon, and it described a particular evening in the fall of his junior year when he had missed his regular ride home and ended up on bus 17 for the first time. He wrote that he had been in a bad stretch, not the kind that generates concern calls to parents, but the kind that sits quietly inside a person and changes how they understand themselves. He wrote that Coulter had simply talked to him for the 40-minute ride, the way an adult talks to a person, not to a student or a CEO's son, or a demographic category, and that at the end of the ride he had said something Preston had not heard from anyone in approximately 2 years. Don't let your life become someone else's presentation. Preston did not explain in the letter what this meant to him specifically. He did not need to. Delaney finished reading all 300 on a Friday evening and sat with them for a long time before she began writing the program notes. What she had was not a thank you to one person but a forensic account of what Route 17 had actually done, not in aggregate statistics, but in the granular texture of individual lives, and it was the only record in existence that could hold that information in a form that 300 people in an auditorium could encounter directly and simultaneously. Tessa, Mercer's events coordinator, had reviewed the graduation program draft 4 days before the ceremony and flagged a 12-minute segment described as a community recognition moment for school support staff. Tessa responded that any recognition for non-academic personnel should be handled as a brief mention during opening remarks and not built into the formal program as a standalone item. The events coordinator relayed this to Cassidy, who called Delaney, and the two of them spent 20 minutes discussing their options. Delaney said she was not going to gut the segment. Cassidy said she agreed. Neither of them needed to decide anything further yet. The ceremony was still 4 days away, and 4 days was enough time for situations to clarify themselves. Preston had known for 2 weeks that his mother's gift came with a condition, because he had overheard the relevant conversation through a door that had not been fully latched. He had not been eavesdropping deliberately. He had walked down the hall and heard Tessa's voice speaking with the precision she reserved for calls she wanted to conclude efficiently, and he had stopped walking before he consciously decided to. She was describing Route 17 to someone on the other end. He gathered it was someone from the Foundation's legal team. As an operational inefficiency that the board had been carrying for years out of habit rather than strategy, and that the restructuring provision in the gift agreement would provide the administrative cover to address it without requiring the school to defend the decision independently. Preston stood in the hallway for 90 seconds before continuing to the kitchen. He made himself a bowl of cereal and sat at the counter and thought through what he had just heard, the way he worked through difficult problems in physics, starting from the known facts and following them forward until he arrived at the conclusion the structure was pointing toward. The known facts were these: his mother's gift, if accepted as written, would eliminate the funding mechanism for the route that had carried Marcus and Priya and Eli and 37 other people in his graduating class to school for somewhere between 1 and 4 years. Several of those people would not have graduated without it. He went to his mother's home office that evening and knocked on the open door. Tessa was reviewing documents, and she looked up with the expression of someone who had allocated her evening efficiently and was tracking against that allocation. Preston asked whether she had read any of the letters the graduating students had written. She said she had been sent a summary from the events coordinator and that it was a thoughtful gesture. He asked if she had read the actual letters, not the summary. She said the distinction was not particularly relevant and asked what was on his mind. He told her he had heard the call. Tessa's expression shifted into the particular neutrality she wore when she was deciding how to reframe a situation without conceding its terms. She said that what she was doing was helping the school build something that would serve thousands of students over decades, and that the difficult part of that kind of work was accepting that transitional periods involve trade-offs that not everyone would understand immediately. Preston said he understood the logic. He also said he understood that the trade-off had a specific shape, which was that the students whose transportation depended on Route 17 were disproportionately the students with the least access to alternatives. Tessa told him that the school had obligation frameworks in place for students with documented hardship situations, and that the existing systems would absorb the impact. Preston said he did not believe that was accurate, and that if it were accurate, she would have included it in the press materials rather than in an annex. Tessa set down her pen and said he was welcome to have opinions about the policy, and that she would always listen to them, but that the event on Thursday was significant for the family and for the foundation, and she was asking him not to introduce complications into a day she had spent 4 months organizing. He said he understood and left the room without agreeing. The following morning he went to find Delaney before first period and told her what he knew about the annex. She told him she had been aware for 2 weeks. He said that if the recognition segment was cut, he would read his letter during his valedictorian address regardless of the program structure, because the letter was about Route 17 and about what the route had actually done, and if that information was going to exist anywhere in that auditorium, it was going to exist. Delaney looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a variable they had been uncertain about. Then she said, "I'll keep the segment in." Tessa Mercer took the stage at 11:22, introduced by Vaughn Holloway, with language emphasizing the Mercer family's deep commitment to educational excellence and their generosity in supporting the next generation of leaders. She wore the cream linen without a wrinkle, carried herself with the practiced ease of someone who had delivered remarks to audiences twice this size, and spoke for 14 minutes in language that was burnished and precise, and built around a central theme she had workshopped with her communications team. That genuine opportunity was not given but built, and that the programs and endowments that institutions committed to today were the scaffolding of the futures that students would construct for themselves tomorrow. She spoke about the Mercer Leadership Center in terms of legacy and vision, and the irreplaceable value of environments designed for growth. She praised the faculty, praised the students for their resilience and competitive spirit, and spoke about the responsibility of institutions to invest not in what had worked yesterday, but in what would be required tomorrow, to look forward rather than backward, to replace the comfortable and familiar with the structures a changing world actually demanded. And then she said the sentence that had been polished until its surface was smooth enough that a person not already looking for it might miss the edge. A great school cannot spend its future carrying the past in old vehicles. It has to build the new structures that will take the next generation somewhere none of us have been. The sentence landed differently for different people. The board members in the reserved section who had reviewed the gift annex heard it as a directional signal. Several students in the graduating class who had ridden Bus 17 heard it as something that required no interpretation. Coulter stood at the edge of the eastern lot and heard it on a small portable speaker that one of the grounds crew had placed near the staging area. He listened without changing his expression. Harper was standing beside him. She had been watching the stage for the full 14 minutes, and when the line about old vehicles landed, she looked at her father and said that if he continued to stay quiet, they were going to dismantle everything he had built over 7 years and use the occasion to congratulate themselves for it. Coulter looked at his daughter for a long moment. He said that the answer to what Tessa had built could not come from him, not most effectively, not in this context, because what needed to be said had to be said by the people who had lived it, and the people who had lived it were sitting in the graduating class in navy gowns holding programs that still, as of that morning, contained a 12-minute segment that Cassidy Monroe had not removed from the schedule. Cassidy was standing backstage at that moment, her clipboard against her chest, listening to Tessa finish her remarks. She had received a third message from the events coordinator, asking whether the recognition segment had been confirmed as abbreviated. She had not replied. She was watching the graduating class from the side stage entrance, 300 young people in navy and gold sitting in neat rows, and she was doing the arithmetic that she had been doing for 4 days. If the segment stayed, the afternoon changed, and the change that followed was the kind that did not reverse. If the segment went, nothing changed at all. Preston appeared at the backstage entrance 2 minutes after Tessa finished speaking, not agitated or performative, simply moving like a person who had decided what he was going to do and was now doing it. He found Cassidy and handed her his letter, a single folded page, and told her that if the segment was in the program, she could use it there, and if it wasn't, he would use it himself in his address. Cassidy looked at the letter, then looked at the 300 students visible through the entrance. She uncapped her pen and drew a line through the note she had been considering writing to the events coordinator. She said, "We're keeping it." Vaughn Holloway returned to the podium at 12:41, after the formal recognition of academic awards and before the conferral of diplomas. He spoke without reading from notes, which was itself a signal to the people who had been watching him manage the morning. Vaughn always read from notes when he was performing a function, and he set the notes aside only when he was speaking from a different kind of authority. He said that before the class of this year received their diplomas, the school wanted to honor someone whose contribution to the day was not metaphorical. He said that for 7 years, a man had arrived before most of the faculty, had driven the route that made consistent attendance possible for a significant portion of every graduating class, and had done this with a quality of attention to the students in his care that had been, as it turned out, noticed by every single one of them. Tessa Mercer, seated in the front row of the reserved section, looked at Vaughn with an expression of confused displeasure. This portion of the program had not been in the version she had reviewed. She turned to look for the events coordinator and found no one in her immediate sight line who could explain what was happening. Delaney Brooks walked onto the stage carrying the wooden box. She set it on the small table beside the podium, opened the lid so the contents were visible, and said that 300 graduating students had each written a letter to the same person. The name on the box was Mr. Coulter Briggs, driver of Bus 17. She asked Coulter, visible at the far edge of the lawn near the eastern lot, to come forward. The auditorium went quiet in the specific way that happens when a room collectively recalibrates its attention. Coulter walked across the lawn in his faded uniform without hurrying, and the silence followed him from the eastern lot all the way to the stage steps. Harper, standing where she had been for the past 2 hours, pressed her fingers against her mouth and did not take a step. Preston Mercer was the first speaker. He had been given permission to go first because Delaney understood, after reading his letter, that his testimony had a particular structural function. It established that Route 17 was not a story about distance or poverty in the abstract, but about specific people in specific moments whose needs had been met by one person's sustained attention. Preston stood at the microphone in his graduation gown and read his letter without embellishment. He told the audience about the fall evening in his junior year, about the 40-minute ride, about the sentence Coulter had said about not letting a life become someone else's presentation. He said that Coulter had not needed to do any of what he did for the students on that route, and that he had done it anyway, every morning, for 7 years, and that this was not a small thing in a world where most people do the minimum the role requires and call it service. After Preston, 6 other students came forward in pairs, each reading 2 or 3 sentences from their letters directly. The selections Delaney had chosen were not the most emotionally dramatic passages in the collection. They were the most evidentially specific. Marcus's paragraph about the hardship waiver referral, Priya's account of 3 years of schedule accommodation, Eli's 11 weeks of breakfast, a student named Janelle who described how Coulter had noticed she was struggling with mathematics, not because she had told him, but because he had been paying attention, and who had arrived at school one morning to find a note on the whiteboard directing her to an after-school resource she had not known the school funded. The testimony was methodical and cumulative, and by the 4th student, the shape of what was being described had become visible to everyone in the auditorium. Not a collection of kind gestures from a warm-hearted individual, but a parallel support system that had been running alongside the official one for 7 years, operating in the gaps the official system left, sustained entirely by one person's competence and his decision, made long before any of these students arrived at Hawthorne Ridge, to use what he knew how to do in the place where it was most needed. When the 6th pair finished, Delaney stepped back to the microphone and said that all 300 of the students receiving diplomas today had contributed letters. Then she gave the signal. All 300 graduates stood simultaneously, each holding a letter. It was not a choreographed gesture. Delaney had simply asked them to stand and hold their letters when she gave the signal, and they had done it with the simplicity of people who understood exactly what they were doing. 300 standing graduates, each holding a sheet of paper, facing a man in a faded uniform who had arrived at the eastern lot before 6 in the morning, created a visual that the television camera near the entrance arch had no difficulty framing. Vaughn Holloway looked at the standing class for several seconds before he looked at the board members. Sterling Quinn was already looking at him. Tessa Mercer was looking at the 300 letters. She had set down her water glass at some point during Preston's remarks and had not picked it up again. Sterling Quinn walked to the podium without being introduced. He was 71 years old and had chaired the school board for 9 of those years, and he had the bearing of someone who had decided, before leaving the reserved section, that the next several minutes were going to be uncomfortable regardless of how they were managed, and that the only question worth answering was whether the discomfort served the correct purpose. He said that he wanted to speak directly to the school community about something that had not been part of the original agenda, but that the testimony of the graduating class had made it impossible, in good conscience, to defer. He said that the Board of Trustees had been reviewing a proposed gift agreement that included provisions related to the school's transportation budget, and that those provisions would have resulted in the discontinuation of Route 17 and the access program it supported. He said this plainly, without softening language, and the sound that came from the audience when he finished the sentence was the involuntary collective response that happens when an institutional secret is named in the open air. Tessa Mercer sat with the stillness of a person controlling a response with visible effort. Her jaw had set. Several board members near her did not look in her direction. Sterling said that the board had arrived at a decision following a private meeting the night before, and he stated 3 things clearly and in sequence. The Route 17 access program would be permanently funded, with dedicated budget allocation reviewed annually by the board and protected from operational restructuring under any future gift agreement. The Mercer Legacy Group gift, if accepted by the school, would be restructured to allocate no fewer than $1.5 million towards student transportation and nutrition programs, with the remainder available for the proposed Leadership Center under revised terms. And Coulter Briggs would be invited to join the school's Operations and Student Access Advisory Committee, with a formal role in reviewing transportation and attendance infrastructure, recognizing that his expertise extended considerably beyond the job description that had been assigned to him. Sterling said nothing else. He returned to his seat. Tessa stood. She said, with the precision of someone selecting words in real time from a narrowing set of available options, that announcing modifications to a private gift agreement during a public ceremony was not standard institutional governance, and that the foundation expected a formal conversation before any revisions were treated as finalized. Sterling said, without returning to the podium, that the board considered the public nature of the announcement appropriate, given the public nature of the conditions that had triggered the review. The exchange lasted approximately 30 seconds. It was not resolved in those 30 seconds. It was, however, concluded. Preston rose from his seat in the graduating class, still in his gown, and said loud enough for the rows around him and the stage microphone to carry. His mother had always told him that leadership meant being accountable to something bigger than your own plan, and he thought this was that. Tessa looked at her son. She said nothing. The camera had swung toward the exchange before Preston finished speaking. Coulter, who had been standing on the stage throughout the board announcement, walked to the microphone when Delaney asked if he wanted to say something. He stood there for a moment, not to think, but to let the weight of what he was about to say settle correctly. He said, "If Route 17 stays open, everything that needed to happen today has happened." He stepped back. He did not add to it. The formal ceremony ended at 2:15. The grounds crew began collecting chair rows from the outside in. The white ropes came down from the reserved section. The navy carpet was rolled from its far end toward the stage, and the school gradually reassembled itself from an event into a place. Most parents departed with their graduates in the hour following the diploma conferral. Photographs on the lawn, a few lingering conversations near the stage, the slow dispersion that follows every ceremony. The television crew packed their equipment and left by 2:30. Coulter stayed. He was at the front of bus 17, checking the windshield washer reservoir, when Tessa Mercer crossed the eastern lot toward him. She was alone, no communications director, no events coordinator, no envelope in her hand. She stopped a few feet from the bus and said she wanted to apologize. Coulter set down the washer fluid cap, straightened up and looked at her. Then he said, "You don't owe the apology to me first. The people it belongs to are the ones who sat on this bus for 4 years not knowing their route was being evaluated for elimination while they were doing everything they were supposed to do to stay in school." She looked at him. He said this without heat, not as a rebuke exactly, but in the way that a person states a fact that is also a redirect. Because the fact is more important than the interpersonal transaction it interrupts. Tessa was quiet for several seconds. She said she had not fully understood what the annex would mean in practice. Coulter said he believed her. He said that the way he understood it, the annex had been designed to describe an operational efficiency measure, and that operational efficiency measures were frequently written by people who had not ridden the route. She asked what that meant. He said it meant that the numbers in a transportation budget describe cost per mile and students per route day, and that what the numbers do not describe is the student who gets on the bus at 6:15 in the morning, because it is the most reliable structure in her week, or the student who eats breakfast on the bus, because the bus is where breakfast is available, or the student who stays on the route for 4 years and graduates on time and goes to college because someone was paying attention to whether the route was working for the people on it and not just working on paper. She asked if she could ride Route 17 sometime. Coulter said the bus ran every school morning and she was welcome on any of them. She came 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday in early September, in the kind of clothes that made it clear she was not accustomed to early morning bus rides, but that she had made an effort not to be visibly out of place. Coulter introduced her to each student by name when they boarded. She sat in the 3rd row and watched the pickup stops go by. The student who walked out from a dirt road junction a 1/4 mile from the nearest paved surface, the student already reviewing note cards before the bus was moving, the pair who were exhausted in the way that teenagers with long commutes and part-time jobs are exhausted on Tuesday mornings, and who nevertheless arrived ready. She did not say anything profound on the ride. She watched, and she was quiet, and when she stepped off at the school entrance, she thanked Coulter in a way that was shorter and more specific than anything she had offered in the ceremony. The Route 17 Access Program was formally codified in the school's operating charter the following spring. The wooden box with its 300 letters was mounted in the main hall near the guidance suite, behind glass, with a small typed card explaining that the letters had been presented at commencement and represented the case that was made. and the case that succeeded for keeping the program running. The seat directly behind the driver's position on Bus 17 was marked with a small brass plate that 3 members of the carpentry elective had made voluntarily and asked Coulter to accept. It read, "This seat belongs to everyone who needed it." In the October of the following year, a new student boarded Bus 17 for the first time. She was a freshman who had arrived at the stop 4 minutes early because she was not sure how these things worked and had decided that being early was less risky than being late. She climbed the steps, saw the brass plate on the front seat, and asked Coulter if the seat was taken. He looked at the plate for a moment, and then he looked at her, and he said, "The people who sat there before you left enough behind to get you started. The rest is yours." She sat down. He closed the door. Bus 17 rolled out of the stop and into the morning, the same route it had run for 7 years, carrying the same kind of weight it had always carried, not the weight that registers on a maintenance form, but the weight of someone dismissing, one more time, that the distance between where a child starts and where a child deserves to arrive is not an abstraction but a road, and that someone who knows how to drive it ought to.